On December 22, 1990, the Teed family set off for their mountain cabin in snowy Weber Canyon, Utah, USA. Christmas was just around the corner, and like every year, they wanted to spend the holidays in their remote, cozy cabin, far away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, surrounded by snow, mountains, and family. As they did every year, they were looking forward to riding snowmobiles together through the snow-covered landscape and enjoying the quiet, wintry nature to the fullest. 19-year-old Linne Tiede was with her mother, Kay, and grandmother, Beth Potts, decorating the house for the holidays. Stockings were already hanging over the fireplace. An icy wind was blowing outside, and soon the familiar voices and laughter of family and friends would fill the cabin. What they didn't know was that two men had already gained access to the cabin, 25-year-old Lester Taylor and 21-year-old Edward Stephen Deli. Both had been released from prison on parole just a week earlier. Instead of taking up work as required, they had hidden in the mountains. There, they broke into empty cabins and eventually spent the night in the Tiede family's cabin. In a phone call, Taylor had even announced that he wanted to wait for the residents to return so he could steal their vehicle. The family's return was uneventful at first. Kay, Beth, and Linne fought their way through heavy snowfall to the cabin. Linne peered through the kitchen window and noticed movement behind the refrigerator. She didn't think anything of it. Maybe it was her cousin trying to surprise them, but when Linne entered, a man she didn't recognize with curly hair and a gray hoodie emerged from the shadows and pointed a gun at her. Seconds later, Kay and Beth were confronted by a second armed man in the hallway. The mood in the house changed abruptly. Kay, terrified, tried to negotiate. She offered the men everything they wanted, but before she could finish her sentence, Taylor fired without warning, twice. Kay fell to the floor, fatally wounded. Linne watched helplessly as her mother died. When she turned around, she saw her grandmother being shot in the head. Blood covered the floor. For Linne, it all felt surreal, like she was in a nightmare from which she would wake up at any moment. But the horror had only just begun. While Linne was still trying to process the shock, she heard the sound of one of the family's snowmobiles. Her father, Rolf, and her younger sister, Tricia, were approaching the cabin. Still in shock, but filled with the will to survive, Linne thought quickly. She had to warn them, or at least buy some time. But before she could react, Taylor grabbed her and led her to the garage at gunpoint. There, he ordered her to show him where the car keys were. At that very moment, Rolf and Tricia arrived. One of the men, now wearing a ski mask, jumped out of the house and pointed his gun at the father and daughter. He ordered them to come into the house immediately. When Rolf saw his daughter, he knew the worst. Her tear-stained eyes, her trembling body. This couldn't be a harmless incident. He obeyed silently and without resistance. Inside the house, the perpetrators demanded money. Rolf took everything out of his pockets and threw it on the floor, but Taylor gave the order to shoot him. The first shot clicked empty. The gun misfired. The second attempt also failed. But on the third try, the bullet tore through Rolf's face. He collapsed. Linne believed her father was dead too. 3 loved ones wiped out in a matter of minutes. The stench of blood and gasoline hung in the air. Everything was eerily quiet. And yet Linne had no time to grieve. The perpetrators apparently intended to set fire to the house to cover their tracks. There were several gasoline cans for the snowmobiles stored in the cabin, easy access for Taylor. He spilled gasoline on the upper floor. Shortly thereafter, the fire alarm went off. The fire ate through the walls while Taylor and Deli fled with their hostages. Linne and Tricia were forced to drive the snowmobiles. Taylor and Deli sat behind them. The girls thought they would be killed as soon as they reached their destination, the family car. But then, out of nowhere, a relative appeared, their Uncle Randy. He waved to them unaware. The sisters didn't dare warn him. One wrong look, one careless attempt, and he could die too. So they drove on. But Randy became suspicious. Why were his nieces ignoring him? Why did they seem so tense? He drove to the parking lot where the family's cars were usually parked. Just as he arrived, he saw a man without a coat or gloves, completely hypothermic, who could barely get off the snowmobile, his brother Rolf. Unbelievable but true. Rolf had survived the shot to the head. While the perpetrators fled with the girls, he had pretended to be dead. Later dragged himself to the bathroom, torn the burning clothes from his body, and extinguished himself in the shower. Then, driven by desperation and fear for his daughters, he drove after them despite his serious injuries. Now he was here, bleeding, semi-conscious, but alive. Randy was shocked when he saw his brother in this condition. His face swollen, his chin bloody, his eyes blurry, but Rolf could speak. And he said only one thing. "They have Linai and Trisha." There was no time to lose. Randy helped Rolf into the back seat of his car, jumped behind the wheel and drove off. Fortunately, his car, a rare luxury at the time, had a built-in car phone. Randy immediately tried to call 911, but the reception was poor, and the connection kept dropping. Nevertheless, Randy didn't give up and managed to reach the police. While driving, he described the situation, the perpetrators, and the vehicle to the police. Then he lost the connection again. Without hesitation, he drove to the nearest gas station, ran to a payphone, and called 911 again. The information was now complete. 2 armed men with hostages traveling in a silver Lincoln. The Summit County Police responded immediately. Meanwhile, Linai and Trisha were still on the road with their kidnappers. Taylor and Deli had forced them into the family car. The girls sat in the back, next to each other, their minds racing. Trisha noticed that one of the perpetrators had put his gun in the trunk. Hope? Maybe. But the men were alert. One of them suddenly revealed a knife he had hidden in his coat pocket, as if he had read their minds. At the same time, Randy raced after the route the perpetrators had presumably taken, with the seriously injured Rolf. Then, suddenly, in the distance, the vehicle they were looking for. Randy got closer. The police were already on their way, but it took minutes that felt like an eternity. Randy considered forcing the car off the road, but one wrong move and his nieces could die. Finally, sirens in the distance. The police were there. What followed was a nerve-wracking chase through the snow-covered streets. The Lincoln skidded across the road, trying to swerve. But then, a mistake. The perpetrators lost control. The vehicle crashed down an embankment and came to rest on its side. The silence that followed was eerie. Then, movement. 2 figures climbed out of the car. It was Linai and Trisha. They raised their hands, trembling, and shouted that they were hostages. The officers immediately drew their weapons, surrounded the car, and shouted at the perpetrators to surrender. Taylor and Deli had no choice. They were arrested without resistance but without a hint of remorse. The girls, exhausted, traumatized, completely broken, collapsed. But one of the officers stepped up to them, gently placed a blanket over their shoulders, and said the words they had dared not believe. "Your father is alive." For a moment, Linai and Trisha thought they had misheard. Their father, alive. Just a few hours earlier, they had watched him being shot in the face. How he collapsed, how he lay motionless on the floor. That he had survived seemed like a miracle. A miracle that, for a moment, took away the horror they had experienced. In the hours after Taylor and Deli were arrested, the investigation began at the scene of the crime. The police found a scene of horror. Blood on the wooden floorboards, charred remains, the smell of burnt hair and clothing in the air. The Tide family's once cozy vacation home had become a crime scene that looked like something out of a horror movie. The carpet in the living room was soaked with blood, and a large pool of blood had formed in the garage, which had already frozen in the sub-zero temperatures. The investigators secured evidence, collected clues, and documented every detail. One of the officers even discovered a video camera that had been set up in the house. On the tape were recordings of Taylor opening Christmas presents and Deli laughing next to him. a cruel testament to the disrespect shown toward the family's suffering. Lenny and Tricia were taken to safety, given medical attention, and questioned. Despite everything, they remained remarkably calm. Still too dazed to fully comprehend reality, they soberly described what had happened. The perpetrators' movements, the sequence of events, every little detail. Their statements would later play a central role in court. Meanwhile, Rolf was fighting for his life in the hospital. The shot to the head had disfigured his face. The fire burned his body. But he had survived. Because he had pretended to be dead. Because he knew his daughters needed him. Even before the smoke had completely cleared, he had tried to get up, torn off his clothes, extinguished the fire, and made his way out. It wasn't just a will to survive. It was love. Nothing else drove him down the mountain. When Laine and Tricia learned that their father was seriously injured but out of danger, they fell into each other's arms. The house that had once been a place of warmth and security for them was destroyed. Their mother and grandmother had been murdered. Their father was scarred for life, but they were alive and they were together. The investigators now faced a difficult task. What role had each perpetrator played? Who had fired the shots? Who had planned it? Who had hesitated? Linne was convinced that both men were equally guilty, that neither was less to blame than the other. And she was prepared to testify to that in court. The justice system began with what is often the most difficult part for many victims' relatives, the lengthy, often sobering journey through the courtroom. For Line and Tricia, it meant facing the horror again, in the form of witness statements, photos, crime scene photos, and the perpetrators themselves. 5 months after the attack, Lester Taylor pleaded guilty to double murder. It was a calculated move. In return, the state dropped several other charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, and arson. During the trial, Taylor claimed he couldn't remember many details, as if his memory had been erased. But the evidence told a different story. The girls' statements, the videotapes, the evidence in the house, everything painted a picture of a cold-blooded, controlled perpetrator. The court sentenced him to death for both murders. Taylor showed no remorse, no emotion when the verdict was handed down, no glance at the survivors. He remained silent, closed off as if frozen. But Tricia and Linne held each other tight. They knew that this was only the first step, and that the second would follow. A few weeks later, the trial of Edward Stephen Delly began. Unlike Taylor, Delly was not charged with first-degree murder, but with second-degree murder, a decision based primarily on doubts about his direct involvement in the crime. The court sentenced him to 62 years in prison with the possibility of release in 2053. However, the judge expressly recommended that he not be released early under any circumstances. The verdict was difficult for the sisters to accept. They had found both men equally brutal. For Laine, it was clear Delly had planned, remained silent, and allowed it to happen, and was therefore equally guilty. Particularly traumatic for Line was a moment during the trial that she would never forget. She was asked to hold the weapon used to kill her mother and grandmother. It was humiliating, but she endured it with stoic calm. She showed where the perpetrator had stood, how he had held the weapon, and described what had happened in those moments. Her strength impressed not only the court, but also the public. When Rolf Tita entered the courtroom, severely scarred but alive, Delly froze. It was the moment when the perpetrators realized that they had not only failed, they had to face the pain and vivid memories of the survivors. Linne and Tricia now knew that they had won, not just in court, but as human beings, and they vowed that they would never stop fighting to honor their family's legacy. In 2001, more than a decade after the crime, Edward Stephen Delly wrote a letter to the Tidy family. In it, he again pleaded guilty but claimed he had not planned the murders. He had only wanted to rob cabins, he said, but Taylor had other intentions. After Kay and Beth died, he wrote, "It was too late." He had accepted what had happened and simply moved on. It was a letter that oscillated between remorse and evasion. It took Line 9 years to reply. Her words were calm, clear, and unyielding. She wrote that she forgave him, but she immediately made it clear that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and she would never forget. Shortly after sending her reply, she submitted a petition to the parole board stating that Deli should not be released early under any circumstances. For Line, it was clear that he was capable of more, even at the age of 70, when he would be released. Despite everything, Tricia and Line led fulfilling lives. Tricia became the mother of 2 children and said that that terrible day in December had not broken her, but shaped her. She was no longer the girl she had been back then, but a woman who had survived and loved. After a failed marriage, Line married her childhood friend Nathan. Together they raised 9 children. She continued to believe in the good in people, not naively, but consciously, because she knew how precious peace is. Rolf, her father, not only survived the massacre but fought his way back to life. He rebuilt the burned-down hut with his own hands. The family gathered every year at Christmas in this very place, where horror once reigned. They created a new beginning. For Line and Tricia, the hut was a sacred place, filled with memories, but also with hope. They believed that the souls of their mother and grandmother still watched over them there. In 2008, Rolf Tita died of cancer, surrounded by his family. He had led a full life, proud of his daughters and grandchildren. 3 days after Christmas 1990, Beth and Kay were buried, and yet, almost 30 years later, something of them remained alive. In every story that was told, in every tear that was shed, and in every laugh that rang out in the new old cabin,